Hi, we're here today with Litsa Williams, and we're going to be talking about the subject of going through your loved one's things. It's an important topic, and if you're ready for that conversation, feel free to jump right in, and if that subject's a little bit triggering for you, feel free to come back whenever you're ready. We're going to talk about things and going through our loved ones' things after the death occurs. Where do people start on that journey?
Yeah, this is such a huge question. And I think one of the things that's important when we think about where we start really is practicalities. And I know the assumption is that, we'd go to the emotional stuff, but the reality is that we're all in a different place about when we have to start looking at stuff. Some of us, depending on the loss or the size of our home, we might have the luxury to say, I don't need to think about this yet. This is something where I can put this off for a little while, where I can try to give myself the time I need to tend to other things emotionally or the other practical issues, and then I'll face it. Some of us, depending on the circumstances we're in, may not have that luxury at all. I might only have 2 weeks to be able to figure out what I'm going to do with all of those belongings. And as much as I would like to have more time, I just don't. And so being really realistic with yourself, and if you're lucky enough to be in that former category, give yourself a beat, right? Just give yourself permission to say, I don't need to rush with this. All my emotions are intense right now. If I can take some time, I will. If you know that you really have some timelines that are creeping up on you and feeling overwhelming, this is a good time to sit down and problem solve with potentially someone else in your life. Right when we've been through a loss, our brains, because of the way grief affects our brain, we are not in the best place to problem solve, to make decisions. We're often easily overwhelmed. Tasks like this can feel really, really daunting. So if you do feel like you're on a tight timeline, finding a friend or family member who's a little more removed, who might not be having that intense grief brain, and enlisting them in the project. So that's where I always tell people to start, is just really try to look at that and bring somebody in from the outside if you need some objective advice.
What is one of the harder parts of it? Why do individuals struggle with parting with things?
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of different things that can be hard. The first piece is that often we feel like these things are our connection to this person who is now gone from our lives, gone from this planet. The idea that we're going to have to make decisions about parting with any of those things can feel impossible, because it feels like that is letting even more of that person go. So just on a deeply emotional level, that I think is the hardest part, especially early on in our grief. The other hard part is that it's usually not just one person who's being impacted. There are other people who have opinions. There are other people who might have ideas about when we should deal with things, how we should deal with things, what we should keep, what we shouldn't keep. And so sometimes we're now navigating all of the emotions, and we're navigating everybody else's emotions and everybody else's opinions and ideas. So it can really set us up to feel like this is just too daunting to even begin to deal with. I don't know where to start. It feels like too much.
So is there a too soon or too late as it relates to it as well?
In terms of too soon, there are situations where we have no choice. We have to start going through things right away. There are situations where, somebody has had maybe a very long anticipated loss. So they've been thinking about this, right? They've been preparing before the death happened. And so they're really feeling ready right away. So I would never want to say too soon and then not give the exceptions of those situations. But I would say for most people, because there can be for some that feeling of, I just want to get rid of these things because they're too activating for me. They're too triggered. When I see them, I break down and I start to cry, and I don't like feeling that feeling. Every time I come into the house and I see any of those objects, I don't want them there because they intensify my grief. That feeling is something that is often part of our very early acute grief, and that does start to change with time. And so it really can be too soon for some people when they're just acting on that intense activation of grief, and then they start bagging everything up and they call the Goodwill, they give everything away, and then in the 3 months and 4 months, then they look back and they say, oh, I do wish I still had some of those things. It's just that then my grief was so intense, I couldn't handle it. So those are some moments where if you're feeling that, it can be helpful to start maybe boxing things up, bagging things up, and putting them somewhere else, not sending them off to the Goodwill, not getting rid of them right away, but just saying, let me put these somewhere else and I'll come back to them after a little bit of time has passed to revisit it. On the other end of the spectrum is, can it be too long? I would say with individual objects, there will be things that we will keep forever, right? That belong. I know I have things that have belonged to friends that have died, to my dad. I will keep those forever, and that is absolutely okay. But there are some situations where we know that maybe someone has kept an entire house that belonged to a family member, not touched anything in it, and it's been 10 years, and other people are starting to go, oh, this feels like too long. And in some of these cases, the question that we always want to ask is, has this become a true avoidance where I'm so overwhelmed by it that I don't know where to start? And so I just don't start because I don't have to start. And if we have a conversation with ourselves and we say, wow, if I could snap my fingers and just have the meaningful objects out of that house and have everything else be gone, but the logistics seem difficult, if I could snap my fingers and I want that probably indicates we've waited too long and we've let those logistical barriers get in our way, and that we would like to be maybe unburdened by some of those things. We just don't know how to get there, and we can kind of talk about how we get there. So that's one piece. The other piece to keep in mind is with objects, thinking about what they represent to us. If we have maybe a room that's intact completely, that belonged to our child or, our partner, sometimes people will ask, do I have to get rid of this room? Can I keep it forever? There's no right or wrong answer, but one important question to ask is, when I go into that room, do I go in because I want to feel connected to that person so that I can, have a moment with them before I go back out into my life that they're missing from? Or am I going in there really to avoid the reality of this life that exists? Am I going in that room to kind of pretend that I'm still in the past? Am I going in there? Sometimes people will talk about losing hours of time where they're going back into a person's room or surrounding with that stuff because they just don't want to face the world that's out there. If I'm in that latter category where I'm just kind of trying to avoid my real life that's out there and I've kept all these belongings as a way to have a place where I can go kind of hide in the past, that's a time that we're going to say maybe talking to a counselor would be good, because we want to be in a place where the objects that we have, they're connections that we hold with us, that we allow to keep us connected to the past while moving in the present, not avoiding the present and trying to hide in the past. Sometimes thinking about how what we're doing is really curating down all of this stuff down to what's going to allow us to feel meaningfully connected. And I think when we think of it that way and we think, okay, we can kind of keep little pieces of things that are going to be really meaningful, that makes it easier than thinking, okay, we're going to part with absolutely everything. No, we're going to find thoughtful ways to be able to keep the things that mean something to us, and then let go of some of the stuff that is just maybe weighing us down or activating our grief in intense ways, and things that need to shift. One of the things that's important to remember is we can find creative ways to sort of keep and not keep those objects. So I share often that the co-founder of What's Your Grief, Eleanor, she has really done this amazing work with some of those types of objects that she's inherited, of taking beautiful photos of them that she has turned into prints that she hangs in, maybe it's in the dining room where that hutch would have gone if I had space in my apartment. Now I have a beautiful print. Or we've even seen situations where people have had, if they have an artist friend or hire an artist to do a drawing or a painting of special symbolic objects, that then allows them to keep the object, the representation of that object, while they then give that object away. And maybe there's another family member who wants the object. Maybe there's nobody who wants the object, and that's okay too, because we can be able to sort of honor the thing that's important to remember, which is that connection to the person that we can still feel, even if we're looking at a photo or we're looking at a painting of the hutch rather than the hutch itself.
For some people with objects, with time, it becomes easier. The emotions maybe aren't as strong or as heavy, but then through that process, grief remanifests itself because they feel like there's now this distance from the memory of their loved one. What exactly is happening there?
Yeah, I think this is tricky. Sometimes people will hold on to objects that meant so much to them right after the loss, and then a few years pass and suddenly they realize they can part with that object, and they feel guilt. They feel like, does this mean I am less connected with the person who died, or, I love them less somehow? And it's so important to know that that is not what's happening here. One of the really natural evolutions that happens in grief is that early on, we look for those physical connections to the person in the world. Like, we want to listen to every voicemail message over and over again. We want those sense memories. We want to hold on to all the objects because that person has just died, and we're just trying to cling to any piece of them that is in the world. And amazingly, what starts to happen with time is we start to realize as people that our connections are actually internal, right? That yes, those objects mean something, but what's important about the object is not the object itself. It's that it reminds me of my dad, or it reminds me of my wife. And with time, we start to get more confident in what we call those psychological connections rather than those physical connections. We start to realize as time is passing, you know what? Like, this is inside of me. It doesn't matter where I go. It doesn't matter whether I have that chair that she used to sit in sitting right here or not. I can still remember her in that chair. And as we get more confident in our psychological connection, that psychological proximity we have to our loved one's memory, it then starts to make it easier with time to maybe let go of some of those objects. We're always going to probably keep a few things if we can that are those important reminders, maybe even more than a few. But we're going to think of them as reminders that what they are is they're triggering that internal experience and that internal connection. And that some of these other things that maybe were less important to the person who died, we don't feel as much like we need them to trigger that internal connection. So this isn't something where we're less connected to them or where our love has gotten less. It's just we've become more confident in the internal piece of that connection. That's often what will allow people to eventually maybe sell a home that they used to live in with that person and feel confident that in their new home, they're still going to be connected with that person who died. They don't need to be in that house that they were once in together.
The logistics is a hard one for some people. What tips and tricks do you have from a very practical perspective? This can feel daunting There is a lot of evolution here, but just what are the practical tips and tricks that you could give folks?
This is another one of those times where I'm going to tell everybody to check in with themselves and know themselves. Sometimes people will say, is it better to do it a little bit over time or to just spend a weekend and dive in and do all of it at once? Part of knowing the answer to that is knowing yourself. Are you somebody who, if you have a work project due or a school project due, you would rather work on it a little bit every day for the 3 weeks until it's due? Or are you somebody who would rather block 3 days on your calendar and do the whole thing every day? That can kind of give you an idea of what might work for this. And, that again, if you find that you try one or the other and it's not working, you can always adjust. But I always say there's no right or wrong way. Just think about what your own style is. So that is a little bit of a logistical tip, number one. The second one is I always tell people to learn some grounding exercises that work for you. Like, know as you go into this is going to be emotional. It's not going to be easy. There's going to be moments that get to be too much. And so giving yourself permission to take breaks. And when you take breaks as you're doing it, to actually find some ways to really try to calm yourself down during those breaks. Just, walking out of the room isn't necessarily going to help you to kind of de-escalate some of those feelings that you're having. So if you know that you're somebody who likes to meditate or do deep breathing, maybe that helps. If you're somebody who, cold water is a great grounding tip. So some people just know when their emotions get really intense, they go and wash their face with cold water, put their hands in cold water. There's real evidence that shows that actually helps us to get back in our bodies a little bit and calm some of our emotions down. So that might be something that helps. But just know what those things are. And if you try and calm down after maybe it's been difficult as you're going through things and you realize this isn't working, give yourself permission to call it a day. Like, don't force yourself to keep going through it if you don't need to, if you can take a little bit of extra time. So that just are kind of some of the things with getting things set up. The next piece that we always encourage people to do for logistics is really think about kind of the categories of things that you might want to be dividing things into. There's going to be the things you want to keep for yourself and that you know about. Then there's going to be those things you might want to keep for other people, whether that's kids or nieces or nephews or other siblings, whoever that is, kind of having that in your mind. There are maybe things that you want to sell, things you want to donate, things you want to trash, and then things that you might want to sort of repurpose or create as memorial objects or items. And you might want to set those into a different place because you're going to do something with those. But having those things in mind of just those kind of categories can help people to just get their thoughts a little organized. Whether you want to have areas in your house where you're dividing these things up, or some people just love that I get stickers that are different colors, and these are my stickers for keep, these are my stickers for donate, these are the, and you start to put stickers on things, and then maybe that's a project you can do on your own if you're just putting stickers on things, but then you call in the friends and family to help once we actually start to move things. So you can look at it in terms of which of those works for you. We know that sometimes people will find it very hard to just know they're going to put bags out to get picked up by, Purple Heart or Salvation Army or Goodwill, because those organizations, they do wonderful work, but it can feel big and abstract. There are a lot of organizations that do amazing specific donation work where you can know more about where your objects are going. There are organizations that take suits and women's, kind of women's professional clothing, and they give that to people who need clothing for interviews and or they've gotten a job now in a workplace where they have to wear professional clothes and they hadn't before. And so you can find that there are places that very specifically will take donations of fabric and crafting supply, almost anything that you're looking to donate. You can find organizations that really do niche work with that. And we have found that over time, for whatever reason, I'm not even fully sure what the mechanism in our brain is, that makes it a little easier for us to let go of some of those objects and donate them when we know that they're going to these specific people or these specific organizations who really need them. We've also found that if you have a family member who had maybe a specialty collection, or they loved tools or building things or whatever that is, sometimes you may find that those are objects that you do want to sell or somebody in the family wants. But we have found that sometimes what people will do is they'll go on meetup.com or another forum or page that is for people with that specialty interest and say, hey, I have these, I have this tool, these old tools, or I have this camera equipment. I'm really trying to find a good home for somebody who will appreciate these things. And that sometimes maybe nobody in the family wants that camera equipment, but you can find somebody who online who is really excited to be able to get that. And people will often say, even though it was a stranger, I could tell how much they appreciated the object, and that made it so much easier for me to give it away than when I was trying to force it on my nephew who really didn't want it anyway, and I didn't really want it. So looking for those connections can be really helpful for people as well.